All right, give it up for Leila Benkirane.
In lieu of Mental Health Awareness Month, I'm going to ask that everyone take a deep inhale and exhale with me really fast. So imagine a world where you live in this tiny safe box, and the minute you stepped outside of this box, you are in horrible, horrible danger. But actually, there is no real danger, and you just have a really bad feeling that something horrible is going to happen. This is the way that I lived from early 2020 to mid 2021, and that's because I had a case of this thing called agoraphobia. Agoraphobia, in summary, is this form of anxiety that makes it really hard to leave your house or basically do anything at all. Things can get really complicated with agoraphobia because there's a lot more to it, and it typically goes hand in hand with other phobias and anxiety disorders. But for me specifically, I was so scared of leaving the house because I thought I was going to throw up. As strange as this sounds, this was my reality for a while, and even though it was a somewhat short portion of my life, it shaped me into the person that I am today. First, I will discuss how this all even started. Next, I will talk about what it felt like to deal with agoraphobia and some of the ways I turned to cope. And then finally, I will discuss how I was able to overcome my anxiety and the effects that it continues to have on my life today. Ever since I was around the age of 7, I had this strange fear of throwing up, but I eventually grew out of it for the most part, and pretty much just associated it with me being an anxious kid, until one day in my biology class. This kid in my class was clearly way too sick to even be in school. I remember just sitting in my seat waiting for the bell to ring, and then all of a sudden, this kid just runs to the trash can and vomits his brains out. I knew the idea of vomit made me extremely uncomfortable, but for some reason when this event happened, time just stopped. For the rest of the day, all I could hear was the sound of him throwing up replaying in my head over and over again to the point where it was making me sick. And that event turned into my very first panic attack in the school bathroom. This was the turning point in my life from when my regular anxiety shifted into agoraphobia. According to the nonprofit organization dedicated to health and medicine research, the Mayo Clinic, people who are more at risk for developing agoraphobia include having panic disorder or other excessive fear reactions called phobias, responding to panic attacks with too much fear and avoidance, or having an anxious, nervous personality. Lucky for me, I happen to be all of the above. When I had my first panic attack, I didn't really understand what was happening, and instead thought it was something to do with my physical health rather than my mental health, and I literally believed I was dying. As I continued to go to school, my panic attacks continued to get worse and worse to the point where I absolutely dreaded coming to class, and my attendance dramatically decreased. Within the span of a few months, I began to associate panic attacks with school, then crowded places, then everywhere outside of my house. Now that I have talked about how this all even started, I'm going to talk about what it felt like to deal with agoraphobia and some of the ways that I turned to cope. At this point, this is late January, way before anyone was taking COVID seriously. I was missing school weeks at a time and was actually in the process of transferring to online school. Not too soon after, the pandemic started and everyone went into lockdown. I had thought this was my complete saving grace. I now was not only had an excuse to leave my house, but also felt less alone because everyone in the world was doing the same thing as me. Right before the pandemic hit, I got diagnosed with agoraphobia, and everyone kept telling me not to avoid leaving the house because it will only make things worse. Once the lockdown hit, I did exactly that. And not because I cared about social distancing or COVID, but because I was purely petrified of the thought of leaving my house. I now was going months at a time without leaving my house, and I began to lose my friends, my life, and I wanted nothing more than to be normal again. In the Anxiety Coach article written by anxiety specialist and psychologist David Carbonell, agoraphobia treatment consists of 2 principal tasks: exposure therapy and learning how to identify and control a panic attack. I was determined to overcome my anxiety, so despite the pandemic, I did everything I could to put myself through exposure therapy. I started out small by walking my dogs around the block. There were some days where I could only make it a couple doors down, but even then I was so proud of myself for at least trying. After doing this as much as I could, my tolerance slowly began to increase to how far I was comfortable with being exposed of leaving the house. Every grocery store visit, dog walk, sleepover, whatever it may be, became a huge accomplishment. But even then, I was still so anxious. Now that I was able to leave my house, it was now about learning how to control my intense anxiety, which is something I'm still learning how to deal with today. Now that I have talked about my agoraphobia developed and how I was able to cope with it, now let's talk about how I was able to overcome my anxiety and the effects that it still continues to have on me today. So at this point, I began to fall into a place where I thought I was going to be this way forever. So much so that I began research for the best careers with people with agoraphobia. I thought I was going to have to give up all of my dreams because of my mental illness. I eventually pushed myself to find a job. I was barely 16 at the time, and the thought of maybe having some money of my own was enough motivation to leave the house in itself. I started working at a restaurant, and it was a struggle in the beginning, but I had to take constant 10-minute breaks just to catch my breath outside. But thankfully, the team that I worked with was extremely understanding, and having this job made a major dent into this anxiety disorder. And I now was in a place where it felt like there was a possibility that I could be normal again. According to the National Library of Medicine, an article written by Yale psychology student and Professor Kripa Barham and Raman Marwaha, they described the course of agoraphobia as persistent and chronic, with complete recovery being relatively rare except with treatment or intervention. Considering this fact, there is a good chance that I may never fully recover, and it is just up to me to learn how to deal with it. I eventually was able to get my life back. I had a job, I was able to hang out with my friends, and I was even able to go back to school for my senior year. And then this image was actually from an art project that I was able to do my senior year, reflecting on my agoraphobia, and this is one of the pieces from it. But even to this day, things can be really hard. Even though I can acknowledge a panic attack and I have taught myself how to control my anxiety from spiraling, that doesn't stop it from happening. Sometimes, even if my stomach feels a little bit off in the morning before class, I'm 100% missing that class because, I could throw up in class, and that's exactly what I'm afraid of. So at this point, to conclude, I have told you about my whole journey with agoraphobia. I talked about how it started, how I dealt with it, and the effects that I still carry with me today. Even though I'm in a such better place now, the development of this anxiety disorder will be a piece of me for the rest of my life. Despite this, I am so grateful for the fact that I was able to push myself into the position that I am today. 3 years ago, I never could have imagined a life where I could go back just to sitting in an in-person class again, let alone taking a public speaking class to be able to share my story with all of you today. Standing in this room in front of all of you guys, saying this speech is a huge milestone in my mental health. From an outside perspective, I understand that my anxiety disorder could sound strange and very confusing because having a crippling fear of throwing up that is so bad to the point that I am avoiding every single possibility of that happening, even if it means not leaving my house for months at a time, isn't the most normal thing in the world. But on the inside, I was struggling on a really low level. So if there's one thing you should take away from my speech is that when it comes to someone else's mental health, try to be kind and understanding because you never truly understand what someone else is going through on the inside.